Hey, John, welcome to the course, man. This is Tommy here, the professor of the course, and really glad to have you in the class and been reading your responses here in the forum discussions for week one and wanted to send you a video reply this week. Gives me a chance to say hello, kind of get our conversation started off on a little bit more of a direct note rather than just, typing back and forth. And then I can also give you some feedback on what you've written here as well, which is great in both forums. Thanks for the, I think, careful and earnest work that you've done in both of the discussions. I think what I want to highlight in the first discussion is how the situation on the ground for Habakkuk is so key to the picture of who God is and to the meaning of faith. So I think you've done a great job, especially here in the last paragraph, with these questions that echo the questions of Habakkuk. Um, Habakkuk, as a prophet of God, is horrified at what God is allowing, this cruelty against God's own people by the Chaldeans, some of their most kind of fierce enemies. And God is allowing this, and the prophet is at a loss. And so, this is the kind of context of desperation where faith, I think, has its meaning. And it's in contrast to the ways of um, sort of typical ways, I think, of inhabiting those kinds of dire circumstances. There's a great disparity of power. Those who find themselves at the top of the heap, the arrogant, the proud, are happy to exploit their position, victimize others. And it is tempting in the face of that sort of thing to grow cynical and to think that being faithful to God is not worth it. And yet, the answer that the word of the Lord brings to the prophet is that the just, by faith, will live. That's how they will, in fact, find the life of blessing that Israel's God has promised on the earth, is by a life that, in the face of such demoralizing and overwhelming circumstances, trusts God to provide, doesn't resort to mistreating or exploiting others, but instead is um, willing to endure the difficulties of trusting God to provide instead of uh, trying to sort of grab hold of things to make them come out right or to make sure people get what they want, despite what it might mean for others. So that's the context, I think, in which the faith that Paul then invokes in chapter one of Romans in this thesis statement of his epistle, that's where it's coming from. And so I think you've done a good job kind of giving us some grounding for that. I think I'd want to accentuate in a way that some of the commentators don't. Bart does this, I think, well. There's some of this in Keck, not much in Witherington, but it is that the faith of the human in this context, the prophet, his generation, the faith of God's covenant partner in the world, it actually depends on the faith of God, that God will act in good faith, that God will be faithful to what God has promised, that God will make good on the the way God has been in Israel's past and the promise that that has left Israel with even in the generation of Habakkuk. There's no faith of the human apart from that faith of God. And it's that faith of God, in fact, that I think inspires the faith of the human and gives it to the human as a gift, the fruit of God's own trustworthiness, God's own faith. And so that, I think, is how Paul is reading the movement of the justice of God that has reached its fullness in the gospel about Jesus, that it's a movement from the faith of God to the faith of the human, which the faith of God eventually produces as its fruit in the world. And Jesus, as the Messiah, is the fullness of this faith of God, um, bearing the fruit of the faith of the human. Because in Jesus, the faith of God and the faith of the human are one person. Jesus as God's own heir, God's own future, the human being in whom God has invested all of God's ruling power. That's what faith is in its fullness in the flesh. So I'd want to like bring that out and emphasize that a little bit more maybe than some of our other commentators have. It's significant, I think, that Paul describes his gospel as the gospel of God. It's the gospel about God, who God is revealed to be, especially in Jesus. In the second response forum, um, I like what you're doing with Taubes, and I think one of the things that's good about Taubes that you've brought out is that Paul is in fact addressing some very concrete difficulties among the people of the audience in Rome. And sometimes we sort of want to generalize about what Paul is saying about God and then think that it's a second step to apply that to the particular circumstances of the audience. I think it actually should be in the reverse, that in fact what Paul is saying about God arises from the circumstances of the audience that Paul is addressing. And that you might say the way Paul presents who God is oriented to addressing those circumstances. So I wish more of the commentators did a little bit of what Taubes does. I think Taubes could do this even more at a kind of literary level by looking towards the end of the letter. So this would be the kind of second half of the letter where Paul begins to address chapters 9, 10, and 11, and then 12 through 15, some of the concrete difficulties that the audience of the letter is facing in Rome, hostility with some of Paul's Jewish relatives there, the challenge of a kind of shared life as one body rather than some pretending to rule over others, doing that while they're living under oppressive imperial authorities who are regarding increasingly this messianic movement as a subversive political association in the empire, which of course is not surprising since the head of this movement, Jesus, was executed by Roman authority in one of the provinces to the eastern part of the empire. And then, of course, the challenges in chapters 14 and 15 about sharing a common table, sharing goods, sharing time. People with wildly diverse backgrounds, different priorities, different commitments, habits of life, learning to serve one another and to make a life of sharing with each other. So, that I think is what we should be emphasizing more than we typically do as a way of making sense of what Paul is saying about God, about Jesus, about the justice of God, even in the opening lines of the letter. And we'll get into this more in week 2. So for Taubes, of course, this means a, a strong political edge, an anti-imperial edge to Paul's gospel. And I find that persuasive on the whole, just with the caveat that the political edge of Paul's gospel is not primarily something that Paul speaks directly to the emperor or sort of tries to organize some kind of public demonstration to bring the empire or bring the emperor down. Those kinds of political action, I think, certainly have their place and they're more characteristic of a society like ours. But what shouldn't, I think, be lost from view is that for Paul, the political power or expression of the gospel is primarily in the way the people of the audience live, in the way that they treat each other, the way they share a table, the way they share their goods and possessions. They are forming a community of significant bonds. They're sharing power in certain ways that presents a kind of political witness to the rest of the world. And so, as important as, a political edge to Paul's gospel might be relative to the kind of structures of the empire, what it says about their eventual demise, which I think it does sort of prophesy. The focus is really on the way the audience lives as a community with one another and with their other neighbors. And I think that's important for us in our day, because we often rush to think that, our political life is about the way that we influence electoral politics or certain jurisdictions of government. And those kinds of influence have their place for sure, but I don't think we're going to have much healthy power in at those levels if we're not cultivating a kind of commonplace life together of a certain quality that I think is then going to be key to whatever political witness the Christian community embodies in the world. Anyway, a few thoughts there on Taubes. And one note, we're going to talk about the audience of the letter this next week more. So look for more discussion on that. It is clear that Paul is dealing with certain Jewish things in the letter. I mentioned before that the audience is described as experiencing hostility from some of Paul's Jewish relatives. He starts to talk about this at the beginning of chapter 9. He's going to talk about himself as a Jew. He's obviously talking about the Jewish law, the Jewish Messiah, the God of the Jews. But if you look at the ways Paul identifies and characterizes the audience explicitly, this would be in part of his opening self-identification in verse 6 of chapter 1, then again around verse 13 about how he's been delayed, but he means to come to the audience as he has the rest of the Gentiles, then describing them as Gentiles that he's speaking to as the apostle to the Gentiles in chapter 11. It seems clear that while the Christian community in Rome no doubt included Jewish members, and is in some ways a part of the larger people of the God of Israel, the audience most directly that Paul is addressing is of Gentile background. And so that needs, I think, to influence what we understand the force of his teaching to be when he talks about the law, when he talks about the election of Israel, these kinds of things. Sometimes Christians have jumped to interpret those parts of Romans as if Paul were correcting Jews. But I don't think that's quite right, because Paul's not addressing himself directly to Jews, but to non-Jews. But what we got to remember is that these are non-Jews who have now embraced the God of the Jews as their God. They're using the law of Moses as the guide of their life. And Paul wants to orient the way that they're using the law so that it is faithful to the gospel. So that's just going to hopefully change a little bit of how we feel the edge of what Paul is doing kind of rhetorically in the letter, that he's not correcting Jews who are doing things wrong and need to stop doing it, Jewish ways and do it Christian ways instead. It's the common way it's been read. Instead, Paul's addressing non-Jews who have adopted certain Jewish institutions. They have embraced the God of the Jews, the Jewish Messiah, and Paul is seeking to correct certain ways that they're going about doing that. So it's a little bit of a different framework that I'm going to commend, but obviously we'll talk about that next week and then throughout the course. Like I said, great to have you in the class and looking forward to the conversation. I know you said you're hoping to not overdo it this summer, so I hope we're going to find a rhythm that feels sustainable to you, still gives you a chance to maybe rest, recuperate a little bit this summer. But I'm looking forward to the conversation. If you want to reply to this video, obviously you can. No pressure to do that. If you don't want to reply, if you could just, give me a one-word received or something like that, so that at least I know that you saw the video. The video came through okay. Thanks again, John, for some great work in week 1, and looking forward to working with you throughout the summer.